warm welcome to our second Be Ready video. Climate change is one of the key sort of critical challenges of our times. And I think it's our duty to focus on it without distraction. And today's discussion really is designed to expand on the support available to assist your climate reporting and climate risk management initiatives. I think it would be easy to become overawed with the complexity of the challenge and the myriad of initiatives and actions we need to tackle against what we can label as probably one of the biggest issues of our day. But let's just take a step back and consider the fundamentals across my industry sectors. So retail, food, beverage and leisure firms, I think, are at the forefront of climate opportunities and also challenges. I think we should all agree, the past is the past. Our opportunity is to positively influence the future. And it's taken as read that we're all morally obliged to protect the environment. In addition, I see three factors which are driving and positively influencing firms' future ESG activities. Number one, shareholders. Investors rightfully now demand their investments assess, measure and mitigate climate risk. And there's a huge focus, rightly so, on investments being linked to climate credentials. And I think in the future, our selection around insurers and their green credentials will become prevalent in the way we decide which insurers to allocate to certain clients. And secondly, consumers. Never before have consumers focused so intently and with such rigor on firms' environmental activities and commitments. Brands are really heavily dependent now on ESG credentials. And I think we often underestimate the impact a business's environmental approach has on consumer behaviour and decision-making. So now more than ever, those firms who embed doing the right thing within their DNA will succeed. And finally, point three, regulatory factors are another welcome driver of climate-focused activities. Firms are now obligated to report on climate. And this is a major focus for our session today. And I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Beverly Adams, Head of Catastrophe Resilience and Visual Intelligence at Marsh today. And Bev is a contributor to the DEFRA Flood Property Resilience Code of Practice, so has immense insight and perspectives on regulatory thinking. So Bev, just drawing on your experience and interaction with government, can you kind of share some of the context and perspectives that led to the creation of the Taskforce on climate-related financial disclosures?
Thanks, David. That is quite a mouthful, isn't it? And we call it TCFD, although I had to say it about 10 times before I could just get the acronym off the tip of my tongue. So TCFD is very simply, how is climate going to affect your business assets and the way in which you do business? And you have to quantify this. And that's not too dissimilar to things that you'll already be very familiar with from the insurance side. We already quantify things like flood risk. And so it's really putting on top of that a climate prism. But I'll talk more about the nuance of how we do it a little bit later. What I wanted to do was just give you a bit of background on how we landed at this place where all of a sudden in 2021 and 2022, we all need to get comfortable with this term TCFD. Well, the journey didn't start this year. Actually, it started a few years back. Back in 2017, the UK government was one of the first to endorse the Taskforce for climate-related financial disclosures recommendations. And they made a commitment to be one of the first governments to implement it. And it's a new kind of regulatory reporting. So since 2017, in the background, all this work's been going on to get to the place where in 2019, the government then disclosed its green finance strategy. Then in November 2020, they put out their piece on how TCFD reporting was going to become mandatory. So there's been a lot of work in the background, and now the rubber hits the road. 2021, 2022, these are the years where you're going to have to start doing it. And I think there's a certain level of pride indeed for the UK as a whole, because let's look forward to November of 2021, where we will host the 26th UN Climate Change Conference, which is called COP26, up in Glasgow. And so we're going to be very much in the spotlight of climate change, indeed, for the whole world. And so I think that's all part of the government's drive to try and get us doing this already and getting very comfortable with it.
Right, and it's always good to get that kind of perspective on kind of the thought processes that sit behind regulation, and because it sets the context. So thank you for that, Bev. So kind of possibly an unfair question next, but try and kind of demystify TCFD. In practical terms, how do you see it kind of playing out? What does it actually mean in practice?
So Dave, I want to make it super simple. What businesses are going to have to do is they're going to have a section on it in their annual report and their financial accounts and their board reports. You're all now needing to include TCFD sections. And so the challenge is, how do you get that into your world in a quick and easy manner? And what I would say is that there are two elements to it. There's what we call physical risk, which is the impact of climate on your assets and on your business. But then there's also transition risk. So they're the two buzz terms, with transition risk being how you're going to achieve carbon net zero over the coming years. So for businesses, they're now embarking on a new way of measuring physical and transition risk. And that's in a way where my job comes into it, which is to make that easy to understand and a trouble-free journey.
Excellent. You answered the game show question really well, so that's a great start there. And diving into my industry groups in a bit more detail, any kind of specific considerations as far as the retail industry is concerned?
So when it comes to retailers, obviously the physical assets, they can be quite considerable. We can be talking thousands of stores, thousands of petrol stations, thousands of different assets all around the country. And like I said right at the start, the concept of physical risk, that will be very comfortable for people because you already know what flood assessments look like. You know what assessing for things like freeze might look like, subsidence. And so I guess one thing to bear in mind is that you're now going to have to do that, but not just the risk today, the risk with these climate scenarios added on top. And the Bank of England has been really very much leading the charge with how we define those scenarios. And I've spent my year in 2020 helping the banks and financial institutions get their arms around this already. And that's why we know so much about how to look at climate and how to look at these scenarios. So if I was a retail business, I'd be thinking, I'm going to have to do this modeling and I'm going to have to do it for all of my physical assets. I'm then going to need to look at how climate is going to change the way in which things like business interruption might have impact. So let's say a flood event took out one of your stores and yet your store was at the heart of the community. Can other parts of the community continue to work if you're not up and running? And so there's a knock-on effect that also has to be quantified. That's the physical risk part. And I should add that it's not just your assets in the UK, but if you're a UK company and you have overseas assets, you've got to look at them too. So that's part one, if you like, the physical bit. Then part two is this transition risk to net zero. And I like to call it transition pathways because you rightly called out, this is a time for opportunity as well as risk. And if you look at your journey for your products and your value chain over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, how is climate going to be affecting that? How is there going to be demand for different products? How can you be a front runner in spotting those opportunities and making sure that you bring them in so that you can make the most of this? And of course, we saw a lot of innovation during the COVID times for people diversifying what they were selling, all of that. But now start thinking climate.
Excellent. And now dialing into food and beverage, I guess those firms in that segment are probably in the line of sight now, more so than ever from an ESG perspective. And kind of looking at that, I guess, splitting the physical and transition risk, food and beverage firms have probably a lower physical risk in some way because they've got a smaller estate, but it's a smaller estate with higher value assets. So the kind of one site can have a significantly bigger impact on the overall business than perhaps in retail. And then obviously the transition risk as they're moving, they've got the biggest challenge because obviously there's a lot more production and manufacturing going on. But what are their challenges as they move into net zero? What did you think their biggest challenges are?
So I think you've hit the nail exactly on the head. And ironically, last night, I sent a note to one of the companies that we work with who are based in Australia. And I asked them the question around whether the climate modelling that we were doing was covering both the upcoming droughts, but also the availability of water. Because these are the other kinds of things we've got to think about. A resource is going to become increasingly scarce. And therefore, the way that you actually do your production, is it going to mean that there's more market demand for what you're going to produce? But equally, are you going to face problems with lack of resources? And so, again, coming to risk and opportunity, I think we've got to think about how, as you pivot to a position of net zero, if indeed you are manufacturing something like bottles, and that manufacturing process is quite carbon intensive, are there ways that you can offset that? Are there ways that you can use and leverage things like circular economy and almost get a double win, where perhaps from a TCFD point of view, you're able to have some comfort that it's not going to cost you, but at the same time, it gives the right message from an ESG standpoint. And so you're seen as trailblazing and front running for how to become more sustainable.
Yes, I think the more we dig into this, the more we realise how all pervading this climate, the climate debate is, and you've clearly orated how climate change can impact, I guess, consumer demand and the products that consumers require of industry, but equally, the actual manufacturing processes and the availability of water and other kind of critical parts in the supply chain are also going to be shaped by climate and the environment. And that has it has the potential to impact upon kind of the way an industry is shaped. So it's really is fundamental stuff. I would also like to just touch on on leisure and hospitality, and hopefully that sector, I think it's probably right to describe it as being in hibernation at the moment, but hopefully sometime soon it will once again become the heartbeat of our communities and high streets again. And for those firms, I really do see that climate friendly brand is a huge opportunity. So, could you position perhaps some insights on how those businesses can best maximise and develop their brand around ESG?
I think one of the things that we're all learning about at the moment is how what we call transition pathways are going to develop over this 10, 20, 30, 40-year cycle, and how wise decisions today are going to affect that future. And so my counsel to leisure, but indeed all sectors, is to construct that transition pathway, literally thinking about what you do. How is that going to play out? And that's in a way my job to help people do that. I've had the privilege of working with our sister company, Oliver Wyman, over the last year, who are specialists in transition risk, and just learning through all of their good work, the different ways that they've been driving this. They actually run the TCFD Secretariat for the whole of the world. So they are very, very knowledgeable and well positioned to do this. I mean, as you know, David, my background is much more on the physical risk side, and I've had to be a really quick student of the transition piece. And so what I really look forward to doing is bringing all that knowledge that we've learned from working with them, and then bringing that to Marsh's clients to ensure that they can see that crystal ball now and have a view of where they should be doing and what those critical milestone decisions are going to be for their industry. And a final point on this, bear in mind that we've been working with a lot of the big lending companies. Lending organisations, they lend to all different industry sectors, whether it's retail, food, leisure. And so they've already had to do that crystal ball gazing, and they've already had to look at how they think it's going to play through. And so that's some of the knowledge that I'm really happy to be able to bring to the table here.
And that, yes, the beauty of being a consultant is to share that experience and expertise for the benefit of future clients and prospects. And I think it'd also be remiss if we didn't touch upon the role that insurance has to play within the kind of the TCFD framework, because obviously insurance being a key mitigant, and it can help businesses to more effectively, I guess, finance aspects of risk arising out of the environment. But how do you see the modelling work and insurance fitting together?
So obviously, working for Marsh, my job is to help make sure that businesses manage both their operational risk and their financial risk. And I see those two things as going absolutely hand in hand. And so for me, there are some very clear insurance elements of this. For example, D&O risk. It is a mandatory reporting requirement, TCFD. Therefore, it has to become part of what businesses do. If they do it effectively, they're safe, but they have to bear in mind that that is now a duty for the board to address. So number one. Number two, let's just think about property risk, and let's think about buildings risk, let's think about contents risk, business interruption. Increasingly, we're finding insurers are wanting to take recognition of how climate is affecting risk. So you're not just looking at it today, but that's what I mean about crystal ball gazing, because we're now having to model how it's going to change over the coming years. And I promised you that I'd talk a little bit about that, because these models, they're not the same as the models that are currently being used for insurance pricing, because they've got a new layer on them, which is how do we expect flood to change from the baseline of today over the next few years? How do we expect the amount of rainfall to affect the clay soils and subsidence risk? And if we go internationally, how do we expect the availability of water to change? All of those things have a whole separate set of models that are being used to assess them. And last year, we reviewed about 15 different ones, and we've now got ones that we work with routinely. And so that's not an easy thing for people to get their arms around, how to do that modelling and how to work it into your insurance world. But just know that we stand here ready to support with that. And because of me being on the government's flood resilience roundtable, I'm really close to a lot of the insurers and a lot of the technical people who do all of this. And so I would say we have to measure risk, but then we're also working hard to recognise resilience. And so you have a risk level of X because you're next to a river, but if you've made great actions, Y, to install resilience and recoverability. So if you were to flood on a Friday, you're back up and running on a Monday, that's increasingly being recognised within the insurance sector. So make sure that you take thought on how you're going to approach this from a modelling standpoint. The last one that I are constantly challenged by are the specialties. I was talking to one particular company, not sure it fits in your sector, but it was conference organising. And if you think about how climate is going to affect actually the locations where different conferences are required because of the changes that are happening within those countries, that's one important thing. But equally, if we're talking about more hurricanes hitting certain geographies, do you actually want to be hosting a conference there in June, July, August, September? So there's other implications that insurances need to consider that take into account the changing weather patterns, for example.
Yeah, it's really, really interesting because it's all about that modelling capability and using that effectively to predict kind of that longer term picture. Because, you know, going back to one of my earlier points about investors being a primary driver of some of this activity, you know, investors are going to want confidence that a business has a strategy over a multi-year period to deliver a return, and they're only going to have, you know, more certainty around that if they've got confidence that the business has looked into climate, it understands how it could potentially impact the business going forwards, and that you know, the strategies are in place to mitigate that risk. So, you know, I think wrapping up and going full circle back to my intro, you know, it really is all pervading. The good news is that we're here to support from that predictability perspective on the physical risk and the assessments, support through the transition exposures as well, and help clients and customers to kind of model risk, which is going to become so much more important as we go into the future. So thank you, Bev. You know, it's been an absolute pleasure to listen to your insights today. I knew it would be good. And I'm sure you've provided lots of sparks to support our clients and prospects to advance their climate reporting and risk management activities. So just to wrap, you know, thank you for your continued support, audience, to our Be Ready series. Take care and keep safe in the meantime.